All right, let's see if we can get this going then. All right, welcome everyone. We are talking about Pom Poko, an anime film by Isa Takahata from 1994, which was his follow up to Only Yesterday, a film about how wonderful the '60s were in Japan. Following it up to say how bad the '60s were in Japan, at least for native creatures. And Pom Poko is just really interesting. Takahata is a very thoughtful director in the sense that he is very familiar with animation. He uses animation very deliberately. And this is absolutely a film, I think, that does that. Now, obviously, this is a film about environmentalism. I think if you missed that, stop scrolling through TikTok. Come on. So this is clear environmental film. But I kind of want to start by asking, what are some of the other themes in this movie that leapt out to you guys besides just environmentalism and conservationism?
Well, for me, it's on the obviously first flush where you see the village area and the Tanuki sort of running around the village area is also speaking back to the nostalgic aspect of the loss of rural Japan.
Yeah.
The very, very potent sense of things have really, really changed. You have construction equipment, you have building of high rises, you have clearing of the land, you have, and one very, good point that they make of that is like removing a mountain.
Yeah.
Removing a good portion of a mountain to build modern housing and modern districts areas. And, what you see when you start off is a quaint, beautifully rendered, very soft, very pleasing to the eye, rural Japanese village, non-industrialized, just lovely.
Very much like the village in My Neighbor Totoro.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And thematically, these things carry on, don't they?
Yeah.
Well, for me, as I was watching it, and this is the first time I watched Pom Poko in any form. So watching this and listening to that, the starting is in the 1960s Japan, and they talk about the raising of the landscape and that. And to me, for the entire movie, part of it was there were actually a lot of different things going on in my head as I was watching this. One of the big things was change. It's a big idea of change and the future and the pushing back of the past and making way for the future, but still trying to find the way for the past to live in the now, if that makes sense. By that point, what I mean is, as you're talking about taking down entire mountains, there's great scenes in this movie where they talk about taking down shrines and taking down old farmhouses. Like in the very beginning of the movie, they're all happy in this little farmhouse, abandoned farmhouse that they found, and they're just like, "Hey, this life is great." And then suddenly, and it's just all torn down by this big, machinery. And the change is hard on everybody. Obviously, it's change, and it goes hard on those who just aren't expecting it, who aren't looking forward to the future. And when I say looking forward, I mean like having the long view, which is unusual for the Japanese in general. But for the Tanuki, when you realize that they're just fun-loving people and they just kind of like live in the moment, they kind of don't think about what's going on in the future, so they don't prepare that well. They prepare for what they need, and you see that as a thing that goes through the movie. You don't see them thinking, oh, we might actually have to change ourselves in order to adapt to this new environment, and they're just completely hopelessly incapable of doing it. A more minor theme that I got out of this was corruption. 60s corruption on terms of the Japanese, and you see it creep in a little bit with the Tanuki about halfway through the movie. So for the 60s, 1960s Japan, they're coming out of an era of great corruption. World War II, end of World War II in the 40s, Americans basically set up the occupation. The Yakuza are very active during this time period because they're the black market people. They're the people who are just like, why are you waiting in line for your milk? We have it right here. We bought it off the shipment. We're going to charge you a little extra, but here you go. You need medicine? Okay, we're going to charge you a little extra. Here you go. But there's that corruption. And it started legitimizing, and there's a great movie by Akira Kurosawa called The Bad Sleep Well. And it's about Hamlet. It's actually a spin-off of Hamlet. But it's about is that it takes construction companies, Japanese construction companies, because they were the primary economic drivers in the late 50s and early 60s. And they did all sorts of messed up corruption stuff, like bribery, murders, and things like that to push these projects forward because it's money in a country that has been devastated by war. So by the 60s, you see that, and then you notice how they talk about during the movie, like the narrator comes out and goes, and the Tommy Hills Project were illegally dumping dirt on the other side of the mountain,
neighboring mountain,
affecting the other Tanuki communities.
Yeah.
So there's that corruption, and it leaks into the Tanuki community when there's that scene where Gonta is finally healed, right? He wants to go to war with the humans, right? And everyone just goes, Tokichi, he's got the right idea. Let's stick with this guy. And what does he do? He brings in his goons and he pulls out like a toy pop gun, something.
Yeah.
And he aims it, and he says, "I'm taking over," and that's very a corrupt thing to do. Everyone's looking at him like, going, "The hell are you doing?" And then, but fortunately, the scene resolves itself in a very, very amusing manner where they're talking about tempura. John Tucker goes, and then he turns, he says, looks at the leader, goes, "I'm sorry."
It just sits down.
It's done. But so there was that corruption element to it, and which I thought was interesting. But I think that the stronger one is basically just not. The thing that made me sad about this entire movie was their inability to change themselves enough. Even though they could transform and change it physically, they couldn't change themselves, for the most part, to match what was going on, and that's why they kept losing battle after battle after battle after battle. If you want to call them battles, or every.
Well, they did destroy a lot of equipment, but it affected no real
and
change.
They killed people.
That shocked the hell out of me. That was like the news report talked of death. I was thinking, oh, this is going to be fairly nice, and people maybe get a broken arm, but they'll be okay. It's like,
I'm watching the scene, and the trucks are like going into these ravines. I'm like going, I can understand how they went to a bush and a guy comes up, what's going on? But no, they just like disappear into this thing, and then there's one scene where the truck actually starts flipping, and I'm like going.
And this is one of the reasons I love Takahata, because that is clearly him through animation, telegraphing something, right? You don't spend 3 weeks animating a truck, falling off a cliff and crashing without implying this is serious violence, right?
Yeah.
And so
this isn't just fun.
And absolutely, that is the thing. And I think, to your guys' point, I think modernity is a really strong theme as well. Just this contrast between the past and the present, and just the general theme of not just finding ways of living with the present, but like, what is modernity? Like, how do we actually behave? There's a great line at the end where the main character says something along the lines of, I have great respect for humans because it is so exhausting to live this way. And it really brought home the fact that, wow, it's not a contrast between simply two different ways of living. It is a contrast between a very easy way of living and a much harder way of living for the Tanuki.
I'm not gonna lie. If I had a choice between staying crunched up between someone else on a subway or being able to on a golf course at night and eating my fill of food, which way do you think I'm going to jump?
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
Well, it's just very interesting from them foraging and the really, again, like Mutual of Omaha Tanuki wildlife, where they're fighting over a mouse, and they're foraging for food in the wild, and then you see them having to resort to their transformation to go down to buy food, and then the understanding that they need money, that they can't just And the exchange where Madam Red, I don't remember what her character's name is, but they one of the Tanukis tries to pay her in cash, and she hits him on the head, and the cash turns into leaves.
Yeah,
It's
that was awesome.
This is they're becoming more and more aware of the fact that they're losing their habitat, they're losing their traditional hunting abilities, and now there's no choice to obtain sustenance without this strange paper thing, and you can't make it up. You need to get it.
The English delivery of that line was just perfect. When I told you to go out and make money, I didn't mean literally.
I mean it literally.
Trust McNeil.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely, and that is one of the interesting things is this whole idea of and one of the reasons I find that topic, like you brought up, JJ, of that was that the human world and the Tanuki world are consistently portrayed very differently.
Yeah.
Every time you cut to the humans doing something, it is concrete shooting out of a tube. It is, machines digging into the land. It is very different. There are no tree huggers here, right? There's nothing other than very modern human beings wearing modern clothes. And I think that is, it's one of the reasons why the film is, as we were talking about before, not subtle in its primary message, but also in a way, and it's one of the reasons I think that Takahata has power. Like Way for the Fireflies is not very subtle either.
No.
It has complexity, but his message is very clear. I think Pom Poko is very. Pom Poko's kind of directing its message. The main character turns to look you in the eye at the end.
Yeah.
And deliver that. But it is in setting up those deliberate contrasts, setting up those things to say, here are these two things. Let's look at those two things and ask ourselves what's right and what's wrong, and what we should do about these things.
I really enjoyed beyond the overarching message of it. I enjoyed that aspect of the mutual Valhalla thing, where it was like, you got to see when the Tanuki were being Tanuki. You got to see them in this beautifully rendered environment that was just, it made me want to take a walk on a fall day through the woods.
Right.
Yeah. Oh,
yeah.
But it also struck me with that not just environmental message, but the Tanuki, they move into an old house because the old house is there.
Yep.
The Tanuki gather at the shrine because the shrine is there. When you see human beings, you don't see them existing in the extant. You see them destroying the extant, and they're not creating something as equally wonderful.
Right.
They're transformative without being redemptive in any of the creation that they do.
You look at the shrine, how they replace the shrine with this sort of, abstract statue and some water. And it's like, okay, that's nice, but it's not a shrine.
No.
Well, to your point, JJ, one of the things I found oddly on spot, was the construction scenes. And having lived where I lived in Montgomery County during the 80s and 90s, it was constant subdivisions, left, right, front, center. And so those, like, I was watching those construction scenes and like how they did things and what was set up first and what was set up last, and just how ugly it was. And it was just the point of just like, it's just brown dirt. And then going back to what you guys are saying, which is, here's this, even though it's dilapidated, it's kind of a beautiful dilapidated barn. It's in the middle of the grassed woods, and it's in this middle of things, and they can just ease into that, and they can transition into that. Whereas the humans come in and they're just like, that's a beautiful tree, knock it down. A public restroom right here. So, here we go. Let's do this.
Yeah.
And like the scenes where they're, pouring in the concrete, seems like such at first glance, you're just like, okay, they're pouring concrete. But again, right, as you say, he's not going to make that animation for the sake of making that movement. There's a point behind that. Here's some ugly looking sludge going into a hole to make a thing that's very bland, and they're going to call it, oh, this is the causeway for the river that we're going to move because we want the river to go this way instead of that way. And it's just the ugliness of it, the ugliness of a construction site. And then, of course,
that picture of the concrete river channel
yes,
is just it is so beautifully starkly rendered.
Yeah,
where it's like,
It's
oh
just like
wow, that's
it's
I got
like,
you here.
It's just like, can I go back to the laptop farmhouse? You know, I kind of like the appeal of that a little bit better.
And then they'll call it the Piney Forest Condominium.
Yeah, it's in honor of the piney forest that used to be here. Like, thanks, appreciate that. I also thought that tearing down of shrines and stuff is just sort of an interesting modern approach to clearing the way of those things that tied people to the land and gave them that sort of appreciation of the things around them, and all the Jesus statues that show up at one point when the landowner is walking through. He's like, I didn't remember there being so many statues around here. It's like, there is something disheartening and soul-wrenching about pulling the land that bears the respect for support of people and animals apart to pave it and to build all these structures that are not, hand-hewn logs and thatched roofs, that are not, done with care and reverence and integration to the property, stuff that's sharply square and sharply modern and sharply not very attractive.
The scene where they tear down the shrine and take that down, what it reminded me of, for those of you who live in Maryland, what I'm going to talk about, the ICC, County Connector, which in Maryland was a project that was put on hold for 40 years, and it was bought.
Wow.
To make that interconnector in Montgomery County to go from one side of the county to the other, to make it easier. What happened was that it created these causeways where actually they allowed nature to run wild. So that a lot of deer population, a lot of these animal populations came up. And when it came time, when Governor Ehrlich back in the early 2000s said, okay, we're going to move the project forward after 40 years of saying, no, we're not. A lot of things got torn down. And, of course, obviously we're talking about the ecological impact and, impact on animal habitats. But to the shrine conversation, there was my father was a real estate appraiser, and we did a church. And the reason why we had to do church was because the ICC took up their parking lot as part of eminent domain. And they said, well, if you do that, you actually cut us off from everything. There's no way for anybody. The way the plan was created is that there was no way for anybody to get to the church. Like literally, there was no way to drive to the church. It was also cutting off a neighborhood. But for the church, the county said, and the state said, okay, well, here's some money at you. We're going to come in with our bulldozers and we're going to knock out the woods behind you and just lay gravel down. There's your parking lot. And they're just like, well, wait a minute. There's land here and this is a forest. And, if you're going to do this, there's compensation that has to be had. So, even though it wasn't as spiritual as that shrine being torn down, there's, that land development by the owner of a religious institution saying, hey, this is a place of worship. Let's treat it with a little bit better respect. It also goes along the lines of many people who lived along the causeway where the ICC was built had family plots. And that caused a lot of problems because you can't build a highway on a graveyard without moving.
You got to move everybody
in there. And so then the people who are there are just like, but we don't want to move. Don't want to move our son that we buried in our backyard because this is where he wanted to be buried. And we got some of them didn't do it legally, but some of them did. And it was just a tough thing, but it's just that respect of, the land, of what that land means to you, the spirituality of that land. And, when I saw the scene with how easily they knocked down the shrine and just only 4 people standing there going, okay, we're done. walk away, and that kind of speaks to how, like, sometimes there's that disrespect. As there's the other scene where when the Tanuki disguises himself as an actual fox, or as a kitsune,
to go on top of the
and to scare people. But did you notice that shrine was larger and nicer than the one they tore down?
Yep.
And so there's a message there too, which is, you know, a little bit of corruption.
Well, what Brent and I were talking a little bit about this earlier too, is one of the voices for, hey, Tanuki, you guys got to get your act together, and you have to learn to find a way to deal with the human beings. And the way that happens is the mayor's assistant guy with the real scrawny face. He's a fox.
Right, exactly.
And I'm not saying that as in, oh, he's a fox. No, I'm saying that as he's literally a spirit fox. And if you look at it from that perspective, it's like the old shrine gets knocked down, the fox shrine does not, because the foxes have found a way into the system to manipulate it. So undoubtedly, the message for that is influence inside, as you're talking about, Steve, about, like, you know, corruption elements. Obviously, the foxes have an agenda that they're working with. So the fox shrine survives undoubtedly because the ear of the mayor is with a fox who is making sure that shrine survives. Like, interesting.
Well, and it's that contrast between the stereotypical clever, forward-thinking fox. You know, there are stories of foxes who deceive people over the course of decades. You know, and have these very long cons running. With the Tanuki being much more living in the moment, you know, it's again, it gets back to that question of they're kind of not capable of thinking that far in the future. You know, we have to find a way of integrating. The best they'll do, as we see, is wait until they have no choice, and then just find an odd job. And it's one of the other interesting things you see at the end. You know, the jobs that they have are not managing banks, right? They're very just, you know, I found a job.
Yeah, run of the mill. I mean, even the people that they transform into are run of the mill. The foxes are, like, they're very good-looking, stylish people. They're really in there, and the Tanuki are your average Joes.
Well, that's actually kind of part of the title of the whole movie, which is, you know, Pom Poko, which is actually what the Tanuki would do is, you know, they talk about, you know, playing their stomach as drums. Well, the myth is that what the Tanuki would do is that to trick humans, and talking about long con versus, haha, isn't this funny, and an immediate solution, was to get a meddlesome human, and they would do this to get the human to go, where is that coming from? And then in addition to playing their stomachs, it's called Tanuki Bayashi, I think it's called. And they do that, and maybe another one would play a flute or something and lead the human away from wherever it is the Tanuki don't want them to be. And then at the end of it, the music disappears, and the human's just like, wait, where'd the music go? And then the human stops and looks around and goes, wait a minute.
Where am I?
So literally, and that's what that was the Tanuki solution was. Well, we're going to make the humans so lost they can't get back, so that way that's how we get rid of them. Obviously, it doesn't work. Whereas the kitsune, the fox guys, are just like, as you pointed out, the long con. They're just like, they're able to figure out how to get in and just live,
manipulate humanity.
Right?
Yeah. And what's so fascinating about that is how when you see the foxes, or the fox in this case, very much setting up, okay, here's your solution. Here's what you should do. You just integrate into human society. He is doing that with, you know, a certain kind of adult entertainment, very much implied. You know, it's literally selling your body. It is literally making a sacrifice so that you can survive.
Right.
And it is also a very manipulative, you know, kind of a thing as well.
But did you see how weirdly hungry the female foxes were when he brings out the chicken? He's feeding them, and they're all just like, food, you know. And the Tanuki is just like, yeah, so what? You know, do it all the time. So, you know, what's your deal? But it was kind of weird seeing that, how like they're all being so manipulated to do whatever they want them to do. You know, the leaders of the Fox leaders, I guess, in the one particular Foxes, and that they're willing even to do that to their own people, which makes it easier to understand why he goes to what's the one the shape changer that comes from the other island, the one that looks like Wilford Brimley. Him. He's you know, it's easier for him to say, okay, this is what you do. The guys who can transform, you're going to get jobs in this park. You're going to have money. You're going to have this. You see this chicken? It's yours. And he goes, well, what about the rest of them? And the fox just casually, very casually, I might add, sorry.
Yeah.
You know, we had to do it too. Yeah. So, you know, we're going to have to
let those that can't will come along.
Yeah. And I will also point out that, and it's almost lost, there is also a point at the end of that where he says, and also they might find a niche, right? Like they might find a way of surviving. You never know. And you can tell he's throwing them a bone. But it's again one of those things that I appreciate about, you know, Ghibli and Takahata and so forth, is that they're always willing to present a reasonable perspective on things. You know, and saying, here's an option, and it's not genocide, right? It's not like, you know, it's not something horrible.
I'll take the non-genocide option.
Right.
Well, and that's the thing, is that, you know, that's what Gonta is doing. Gonta is like, we have to kill all the humans. Like, that is literally his perspective.
Now, here's a thing that occurs to me in talking about, you know, that little bit where, you know, they could find the niche. England has urban foxes.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
They have a sizable and noticeable fox presence in English towns and villages. I don't know off the top of my head. I wonder if Tanuki have found that same kind of sort of niche, whether they scavenge and nest in urban settings, much like foxes would do, or raccoons or possums or things like we have. I mean, because I would imagine if it's similar size to a large raccoon or a fox, then, you know, I mean, there is a likely chance that they could survive in an urban environment. It ain't going to be pleasant. It's not going to be like living in the fields, but
yeah, they usually live in your chimney. That's where raccoons go in the urban areas. Like we as a kid, we used to clear them out of our chimneys all the time.
Wow.
We had a fox den on our property in Gaithersburg, and but they weren't the beautiful foxes that you're referring to. They're more gray matted, a little bit more wild, and they have the most horrifying sound howl.
The scream, yeah.
It sounds like a small child being murdered on the road.
Yeah.
It's like, can you imagine that at like, you know, wait 1 a.m. and you hear that, and it's like, you know, it's like 30 feet away, and you're just like, please just not be a child, be the fox.
Please don't be a banshee. Please don't be a banshee.
Well, what's also interesting, and this is where I'd like to get your guys' perspective, is on the historical allegory in Pom Poko, because this is something I was not able to, like, I could tell. So, you know, that first battle is obviously a samurai battle, right, and is very much playing off of that. And you can see Takahata, like the sequence where they, where you see, I forget the name of the guy, and the married woman and the 3 kids, all sort of tumbling out of that shrine. That is I think a direct visual reference to a Akira Kurosawa film. So
Rashomon or anything like that?
No, I think it's from Dreams. Which is one of his more modern set films. But
is it Dreams or is it Ikokuru?
I'm not sure. I don't remember.
You know, I think it's Dreams. It's been a while since I've seen that.
Yeah, same here. But I looked up on Wikipedia and I was like, oh yeah, I remember that scene. Anyway, so it's one of those things where obviously he's sort of playing around with samurai film, with dramatic. In fact, that whole sequence with them is very much Kurosawa film of, you know, oh, please don't go. Oh no, I have a duty to my people and all, you know, bird flies over, like, clearly. But there's, you know, I was not able to directly connect a lot of these scenes with any specific point in history.
Well, like think about the scene where they send off the two Tanuki to go to the neighboring to find the elders.
Yeah.
Right.
They put on the monk's straw hat and they have capes. They don't just they're Tanuki.
Right.
They literally can just scamper off on four legs and go do their thing. But they are literally presented as almost like wandering monks.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Where they've got their stuff on and they turn back and they're like, we're leaving. And it's just like, with the sea in the background at one point, I'm like, I know that scene too, but I cannot for the life of me figure out where I've seen it.
That scene is so where with the samurai on the water or the warrior monk on the water. It's just like so iconic. As samurai movies, they're everywhere, but they're great scenes. They're amazing scenes. And you're right, when you see that, you're just like, okay, you can turn into a raccoon dog and just run, you know. But they're just like, you know, it's like this. It's like the movie where they turn around and go, I'll try to come back.
I mean, because honestly, think about
it. You know,
it's a really dangerous journey. They've made that clear. They might never return. I would guess if a human being saw a little tumbly little Tanuki with a little hat on and a little cape, you're damn straight they're not going to return because somebody's going to be like, "Ooh, what's that?" Versus a Tanuki running on all fours, they're going to just be like, "Oh, look, it's a Tanuki," and they're going to ignore it. So yeah, by walking around like a little furry person, of course you're going to be in danger. Like, what's the logic of that? So another one of those things where the scene is so specifically done that it's like, it just drives you mad as to what that came from. Was it wholly created from from another movie, another source, and this is your homage, or what is it?
Totally, yeah.
So when you were talking about historical aspects, John and I were talking right before we all came on, and John, you had a really good point about saying how at the first battle was the Warring States period, and that kind of thing. And you and I were just like trying to figure out what specific battles that they were. And my guess is because of you made the point, John, that the final battle is where the samurai lose, which is Gunta, and that in real life was the second battle. I think the second real battle, the Satsuma Rebellion, where the last samurai, which is who did I say it was? Saigo Takamori.
Sorry,
Saigo. Interestingly enough, you could do a historical how not to do it with the last samurai with Tom Cruise in it. But the actual real life, the actual real life Saigo Takamori, he early on that it's the two opposing factions, the blue and the red. They fight, and that's the first battle, and that's the Warring States period because they're talking about all the different raccoon communities. The second battle, which we were trying to figure out, I think, to me, is part of the conflict between in real life Japan between the Satsuma, who was a very prominent force in the Japanese Empire, and of course as a leader, the last samurai Saigo Takamori, and the Chosen. The Chosen were an equally powerful family, and they were both vying for control of the imperial court in Japan right before the Meiji Restoration. When they all the Tanuki become unified, right? So in real life, the Chosen and the Satsuma did come together, but there was always distrust between them. They did come together, and Gunta becomes the war leader, basically. And that's what Saigo did. He became the war leader, and he promoted the cause of unity for the Japanese people. So Gunta is doing the same thing, but then once everything falls apart, and Gunta keeps insisting that we fight and we kill and we destroy, and that's what Saigo Takamori did in real life, and he winds up going up against everybody and winds up alone in that last battle that you're referring to. And
the Battle of Shirayama in September of 1877.
Okay.
It's in Hokkaido. Wow. It's the last battle where he literally, Saigo Takamori and like maybe a couple hundred samurai led one final charge, and they all died. They never found Saigo Takamori's head, by the way. And Gunta, if you notice, the last thing he does with his small group of Tanuki that are still with him, still fighting at the end, they turn into a big head.
Yep.
They're just doing
Wow.
one last thing and going down the hill and
Mhm.
bashing and smashing as much as they can before they're taken out.
Mhm.
So I think, John,
Yeah.
I think you hit it on the head with the last battle there. I think
That's
that's
fascinating.
yeah.
And that's a really interesting kind of twist where, Saigo, and if you want to read this much into it, Saigo is for the Japanese people against the foreigners, basically.
Right.
Whereas Gunta is for the Tanuki against the Japanese.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
Right.
So there's an interesting kind of self-reflection on that, I guess. And it's also hard. And again, and we were talking about this before. Takahata made this when he was he was around 60. And so when you get up to that age, you get nostalgic. You get to a point where you're looking back on your life and you're looking back to how things were in the past. And it's very natural to look back and say, I think we took a wrong turn somewhere. And I think there's just something that we lost. This is somebody who lived through that. Like, he lived through the 60s.
Yeah.
He experienced that.
Yeah.
So he would know.
Well, it's always fun. Not that the environmental and Tanuki's getting killed. That's not the fun part. It's always fun from Western perspective to watch these things and to have the little sort of bells and lights go on to recognize that not only do you have this intentional history of the Japanese wrapped into things so that things are displayed and shown as a literal, Gonta with his group, how this mates the last battle, the samurai. But it's also interesting to see the casual way that those bits of history come in, because that's exactly any given school class. They've gone through and had this hammered into them for all their
Right.
exams for to advance from middle school to high school to college. They just know all this stuff. So a lot,
Right.
a lot of this stuff, you can get beyond some of the intentional points of it to they already know all these stories, so that some parts of it kind of filter into these different places. And for us, it's like you have to kind of pick through it to find those things.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I talk about this all the time when folks go back to try to watch stuff about the Meiji Restoration or about Oda Nobunaga back in the day. I'm like, this is like having stories about Stonewall Jackson and
Right.
and those characters, where if I tell you Ulysses S. Grant, you know who that is, even if vaguely. A
Right.
Japanese person has no idea what that means, right? And so there's all of this context that you heard about, and okay, this person's on that side, that person's on that side, and we just don't have that context. It's actually one of the things I wanted to bring up is I originally watched. So originally I watched a version of Pom Poko that I acquired. So it was
A
Japanese
version.
Well, a copy.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was thinking like they did a live action or something. Like,
that'd be cool though.
Oh, that would have been interesting.
Yeah, that would have been really kind of kooky.
And then I rewatched this version. So obviously that was Japanese dub. I went back and I watched this version originally with the English dub. And I did not remember this much narration. And I really appreciated how much narration there was in this by the inimitable Maurice LaMarche. Brain from Pinky the Brain narrating Pom Poko, and explaining this is what happened in the 60s. This is all this stuff, and kind of giving that context.
I loved how what he did with saying in the year 33 of the Pom Poko era, and just made it attached it to like as if you were a human and going, oh, this is the fun era of
right
history. In the Pom Poko era, you had that, and
interesting.
yeah, and it was and you needed that context. You're right, because when I tried the version that you gave me, it was all Japanese with no subtitles. I was trying to figure out what the heck to do. I of course didn't know what was being said, but I could tell right away that there was more explanation. I was getting more from
See, it's
English
interesting
version.
because the one I watched didn't have any of like really great explanation of anything. It was just a straight on, translation subtitle kind of thing. And I was like, okay, I think I would have liked to have seen the one that you guys have Maurice LaMarche doing it.
And granted, I went back and checked, and like there is narration. Just to be clear,
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting that they invented all this narration out of whole cloth, but it definitely looked like they went in and they and there is even stuff about like the 60s in there, but they clearly went in and said, okay, let's provide a little bit more context for the English audience who just had
that would have been interesting.
Yeah,
that would have been more interesting.
And I'm glad that you said that, because now that makes it more sense, because the English dub was done far later after the movie was done. And for those of you who watch the English sub, if you look up the cast list, it's a list of, hey, it's that guy. Clancy Brown does the voice of Gunta. Remember that kid from Home Improvement?
Jonathan Taylor Thomas.
Thomas. You have J.K. Simmons is in there. He does Sizemon.
Okay.
Is Richard Simmons in there too?
No.
So the two guys who
that would have been interesting.
The two drunk guys who are talking at the stand while the Night Parade of 1,000 is going behind them.
Exactly. Yeah, Parade of 1,000 on.
That is the Brain from Pinky and the Brain and Bender from Futurama.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, I couldn't do it.
Oh, wow!
Awesome. That is awesome. Wow!
I feel I missed something by not having seen that. I feel I missed something.
Oh my gosh! Oh, and Brian Posehn is in this. If you guys know who Brian Posehn is, he's a 6'3", geeky-looking guy who's very into heavy metal. He's a comedian. And if you heard his voice, it's a very distinct voice. But look up Brian Posehn on IMDb. You'll know exactly who he is. but the narration of get back to what you were saying, Brent. The narration was told in a very fairy tale style, very narrative style, and it's as if it was talking to a child.
Yeah.
Because of course we all know this is spoiler territory. He is the grown-up voice of what's his name, Shokichi. Shokichi.
Yes.
And so he's the grown-up voice of that of that Tanuki. And so, but when he talks when he goes through it, he does a little explanation. So those of you who haven't seen the English dub, he actually talks about it. He goes, and in Japan, when they did this construction, and he actually goes into a little bit of what's going on, and you get a little bit more context, and he describes Tanuki culture, which is in a very humorous fashion.
It's a fascinating thing, is that it's one of the reasons that Maurice LaMarche is so amazing, is because he takes this role where he's again narrating this thing, and he has this playful formalism to it. Where he's saying it, he's saying this is what's going to happen, this is what's going to go, and that was a bad choice. And then he moves on, and there's just little moments where he just throws that in there, and it's just really, really fun. Because
matter of factly,
right, and because he knows how to play around with that narration, to make a point.
Now in the opposite direction, what I also got for those of you who enjoy Highlander. Clancy Brown plays Kurgan in the Highlander movie, the original Highlander movie. So he's the bad guy.
Right.
And
what
so
does he play in this?
He's Gunta.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
That's okay.
So Clancy Brown's Gunta, and the scene where they're causing all the accidents, and he uses his pouch to cover up the window, like fierce look on his face.
Yeah.
I really expected him to start screaming out, "There can be only one!" And Queen starts in with Princes of the Universe, and it just goes.
Yeah.
And then I was telling Brent last night, I said, "No, I had to stop and go, no, come on, this is Pom Poko. I later."
There's a little too much license there to throw in Highlander in there.
I think we make the AMV of that happen, though. We should do that at some point.
God, yeah, that would be kind of funny.
But it was also interesting from an animation perspective. So actually, getting back to that, I think it's really there are a couple of different animation things around. So Ghibli gets a lot of money behind it, And I think it's that one of the things that they do early on in that film, because any advertisement for Pom Poko is going to be about Tanuki, right? You're going to expect it to have a certain amount of goofiness and serious and lightheartedness. And I think those opening scenes are very much there to establish we are serious animators treating this seriously, because animating creatures like Tanuki is hard. Animating animals is hard, and especially Tanuki that are I don't want to say not common animals, but they're not common subjects for animation. So you don't have a lot of reference of that, and so having those first few minutes of no, we're going to show you what actual Tanuki look like running around and all that kind of stuff was them, in a sense, flexing their muscles to say, this is going to have weight to it, which I really appreciated. Then there's some other interesting moments. Did you notice that sequence in the library where the camera is panning across all the stacks of books? That was CGI. All those stacks of books were CGI.
Really?
Oh yeah, quite.
In 1994.
In 1994. Yeah.
Wow.
And I'm like, well,
that's good because I didn't even pick that up.
Yeah, because it's very smooth. It's very and you can see like how they're tracking the 2D behind it, and it's just the art style of it is a little different for the CGI versus the rest, and it's a great example of this is Takahata saying, he loves animation as a medium. Why would you pay somebody to spend 3 years drawing those stacks going by? That is absolutely something a computer can do, and it looks good because it's all of these very simple geometric objects. So I think it was a very clever thing to do, especially at that time. But I also just want to point out, this is one of the few Studio Ghibli movies that has an actual panty flash in it.
Trying to recall where that
Where?
is.
So,
it's not Okyo. Is it Okyo when she and Shokichi are sort of by the tree talking to each other?
No, it is when they are doing the no faces to the cop.
Yes,
and she jumps on the bicycle. And when she jumps on the bicycle, there's a panty flash, and I pointed out because people have this idea of Ghibli being this very serious, studio that would never do that. And it's like, no, it's right there. Like there are 2 or 3 frames where it's very clearly they're doing that for you. Just right there in the film.
I didn't even notice. I mean, that's the interesting part. It's like whatever else, the entirety of the scene going on. It's like that's sort of the least important thing to pay attention to.
Speaking of which, I read on Wikipedia, but I was not able to see it. Apparently, other Ghibli characters show up in the night parade. I didn't see them either. That was the thing. Apparently, like Kiki is flying on a broom somewhere in the background. There's
good night.
Like that.
I mean, the way that they're showing a lot of them, it's just you're so distracted with what's going on. You'd have to go back and do like stop it, look around, stop again, look around.
Yeah. I tried to see, but I couldn't tell. And I also appreciated that they have the skeleton from that one painting. That one famous thing going off. It's like,
the giant skeleton. Like that thing's creepy as hell.
No kidding.
That's a famous print.
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah, what is that? It's and isn't it some yokai?
Oh yeah.
Is? Yeah.
Okay. Oh yeah, it is.
That's actually another interesting thing. Is that what they transform into are basically all yokai in that sequence.
Well, that's the 1,000 Yokai Parade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which there was a series, more than a few years ago. It was Narration, I think it was Narration, which dealt with some kid who was going to inherit all his yokai experience, and he was supposed to lead the 1,000 Yokai Parade.
Mm-hmm.
It was actually a decent series.
Yeah.
I love that whole sequence. I love that whole sequence in the movie of them just going through and just whatever it was that if I was an animator and I was told
That's the thing.
that's what I would have imagined right there, and just being
here's
able
the giant skeleton.
Yeah.
Gasha Dokuro, also known as Odokuro, literally a giant skeleton spirit, 15 times taller than the average person, created from the amassed bones of people who died of starvation or in battle without being buried.
Dark.
Well,
Wow,
isn't that
that's
just particularly
Yeah.
with the Tanuki having difficulty feeding themselves, and the Tanuki fighting the battle where the last battle where they die,
and they're all heaped in a pile.
Right, and what do we see at one point in there with Tanuki are looking off an embankment, and you see road workers picking up a Tanuki and throwing it in the back of a dump truck.
Yeah.
So there you go, Gasha Dokuro. Oh my!
When you look at Google Images, you literally see like the original print, and then like 3 over, it's the actual thing from Pom Poko. So it's like,
there we go.
Right there.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I mean, there's
yeah.
Is that the Takayasha the Witch and the Skeleton Spectre? Soma no Furudari? I think that's what, at least in Wikipedia, it says. Whatever. But yes, go ahead.
That sequence is just a pure celebration of animation. I mean, it almost feels like we chose this movie. We tried to make this movie so that we could spend 3 months animating all these transformation sequences, because that is animation right there. It is evolution. It is change. It is life, giving life to all of these things. It's amazing. And also, it should be pointed out, like you've also got all those shots of all of those humans, and so you got to design all those characters. Like, that's a lot of work to represent all of the bystanders and all their reactions. That was a very complicated sequence, and just very impressive. But yeah, no, totally. Cool. Is there anything else we wanted to cover? It's been going for about an hour.
So I've been trying to figure out whether or not it is a not direct, but an actual close English translation of the nursery rhymes that they sing during the movie.
Okay.
To the actual Japanese.
So I looked that up. Apparently, there are 2 interesting things about that. They said, a lot of them are either the same, or they rewrote them to more closely match what they wanted to say in the movie. So just rewrote the lyrics. But also, they said a lot of these songs are kind of like London Bridge is Falling Down. They're kind of nonsense lyrics that have just been passed on for generation to generation. So like even modern Japanese people wouldn't know what they mean. Like, they don't have a deep lyrical meaning to modern Japanese people, which made me feel a lot better. Because it's like, okay, yeah, it's just words basically. And we just know that they're oh yeah.
Get trapped in your head. I was humming some of those things for a while after I was just like, okay, no, stop, please.
It's funny. I was crying when Gonta and his group got smashed by the car. I did, or the truck. I wasn't humming anything. I was kind of going, oh.
Well, and especially after they got back up after the battle, and you're like, it was all symbolism. Oh, I gotcha. Like, it was all they're actually gonna
just like same sort of thing when you're driving down the road and you see a little critter that didn't make it across the road, and you're just kind of like, oh.
Well, that's the whole end of the movie is the fate of the ones that can't transform.
The ones who can't adapt.
They can't adapt. But it was interesting that the Fox was right in that he said that some of them might figure it out, figure a way out, and be able to do it. And then I found the moment where the one Tanuki turns to the screen and looks at you and says, hey, we're able to do this, but there are things in your world that can't do this. So when you do these things, you're killing them. And then he turns around and he goes, party time. But as he was saying that, as he was doing that, looking at the camera, breaking the fourth wall, I was just like, I'm a little creeped out. It was a little creepy. I was just like, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. It wasn't me.
And again, it's one of the things that I think Takahata is willing to do. Is he's willing to say, look, it's all cartoons, right? Like I can break the fourth wall if I want to. Like it doesn't matter.
Right.
It's all artifice. But it does end up being. It's the weird thing about Pom Poko is, for how on the nose it is, it doesn't become Fern Gully, right? You know, it still has impact. It still really feels. You do agree by the end of it. We're like, yeah, like you have not pushed me away from this at all. I totally feel bad about myself for living in a modern society and not having little critters cross the road.
Well, I mean, and I think that's in great measure the point of having the character turn and break the fourth wall is it sort of sticks it on you. You know, what's going on now is sort of stuck to you. It's not just the great, omniscient observing eye and there's things happening. It's addressing you. Like, oh, stop looking at me.
It's kind of like, hey, buddy, what are you going to do now?
Yeah.
What are you going to do about it now? You know, and you're just kind of like, can I just watch the cartoon?
And as I was saying, to Brent about the stylistic shift from realistic Tanuki to the little pot-bellied gummy bear Tanuki to the way over stylized kind of goofy cartoony kind of things.
Yeah.
I understand, again, like somebody who's 60 years old calling back to something they enjoyed in their childhood, but I still stylistically I could have lived with realistic and gummy bear version. The third really flat 2D kind of thing. That I didn't find that a necessity to enjoy the sort of mirthful Tanuki playabout,
I hear that.
But then I didn't make it, so it's not my call.
Sure, yeah. No, it's fair. Matt brings up Watership Down in the chat, and I think that's a really interesting comparison. I think absolutely there are similar themes. Obviously not similar like stylistic stuff. They don't transform or anything. But it is very much this look at this. What I think is interesting about Watership Down, in contrast, is that Richard Adams kind of creates a culture for rabbits, creates words for them, a whole language. Whereas this film is much more. No, this is all Tanuki folklore. This is all the stuff that we know that Tanuki, so to speak, do. And it's one of the reasons I think that Pom Poko has some of that power, because it's fantastical, but it's like folklore fantastical. It's all of the things that you're familiar with about Tanuki, as opposed to creating kind of an allegory, if you will.
Right. Well, I mean, Tanuki bear such a weight of their existence in Japanese mythology and lore that, you know what I mean? You don't really have to do a lot. It's already been there by centuries worth of work. And again, from a Western perspective, the things we have to glean out of it are just, accepted fact. You know what I mean? Like people have grown up with these sort of like nursery rhyme kind of things. It's like you grow up with it. You don't necessarily think Ring Around the Rosie, pocket full of posies. That doesn't, equate to the Black Death. So that for all the Tanuki kind of stuff, they already have a deep, rich cultural element to them that you can glean out of what's what you need to do for the story.
Yeah, and I think it says a lot about Pom Poko that it gets across everything it needs to get across to an international audience that did not grow up with Tanuki.
Right.
Like, you don't need to know any of that, and you will still absolutely be strongly affected by that, which I think is impressive. Yeah. Cool. Thank you very much for that. That was fascinating.